This is definitely the most depressing time to be a DC Comics fan since probably the dying days of the New 52 when the writing was on the wall. There just wasn't a whole lot good going on. And everybody, including DC Comics, is just waiting for it to die. Like, we got to do something. We don't know what we're going to do. So we'll just keep regurgitating out bad comic books until something happens. Obviously, fans were rewarded with their patience with DC Comics Rebirth. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long, but I don't know what this is. But DC Comics are having a hell of a time selling any character other than Batman. We've covered that plenty of times right here on the channel. That fact remains. And I wonder why that is happening. Obviously, I'm saying it very facetiously because we have covered it here. DC Comics are going on a very dark path, which will likely lead to infamy for DC Comics in the history of the publisher for what they're doing right now and just the long-term damage that they're going to do to their characters, their publishing line. Will they be able to recover? Absolutely. I do think that will happen. These things are somewhat cyclical. Everyone has an up period. Everyone has a down period. But this seems like an excessively down period to me. There just isn't a whole lot of quality out there other than a couple of writers. I am going to show you a couple of examples of comic books that are coming out today. I'm not going to read them, so I figured might as well boil them a little early on New Comic Book Tuesday for DC Comics and tell people just the amount of garbage that they had to look forward to. And these are just a few pages worth of the story. I've heard sensational Wonder Woman special #1 actually gets worse than what I'm going to show you if you make it to the end of the story. Now, I imagine most people aren't going to be reading it because not only is that not a Batman comic, but that's a Wonder Woman comic where the big names on it are Paula Sevenbergen, Scott Collins, and Stephanie Phillips. Not a whole lot of reasons to get excited for the title. It is Wonder Woman, which is apparently a hard sell anyway, made much harder with the current state of DC Comics and Trial of the Amazons. People might actually think that this is associated with that garbage. So nobody was going to read this anyway, so I'm going to spoil it right here. Let's show you the very opening page. The first thing that you're going to see when you read this comic book. It's Be a Superhero Day at School. So, of course, there's a boy dressed up as Wonder Woman. And there's nothing wrong if you're a boy and your favorite character is Wonder Woman and you would like to support that character with a shirt, a hat, or whatever. But there just aren't a whole lot of boys that are going to be going to the nines on the old Wonder Woman costume and wearing the tiara and the skirt. But of course, this character, this young boy, is the exception to the rule because DC Comics are trying to reach an audience. What audience that is, I'm not really sure. Is it big enough to support a character like Wonder Woman or a publisher like DC Comics? I think we know the answer to that, and that is absolutely not. But DC Comics continuously pushes weird stuff like this down our throats. As soon as you see this on the opening page of the comic book, you can no longer take it seriously. I honestly thought when Dan Didio was fired by DC Comics, it was a smart move. It felt like he did not have a good grasp on what DC Comics fans wanted. But it turns out that this has been the biggest disaster in recent DC Comics history, even bigger than the New 52, because at least then there was leadership. There was a vision. It appears that under the leadership, the sole leadership of Jim Lee, that DC Comics is essentially rudderless. The inmates are running the asylum. What are DC Comics trying to do under Jim Lee? What is the vision of DC Comics? Is it to turn off every single comic book fan that likes their heroes? Is it to ensure that no one will ever try one of these special comic books again, that no one has any faith in any title that they have? Even if I sit here and I tell you, I think Action Comics is good. I think you should be reading Robin because it's really high quality. There's enough people that have been burned by DC Comics in this era that they're like, you know what? Maybe for one issue it was good, but I don't believe and I don't trust DC Comics that it could ever continue with the current state that they're in. And when you see pages like this, you can understand why. Why would anyone in the world trust DC Comics? And I know there are some naysayers out there that don't exactly agree with what I'm saying regarding DC Comics sales in their future and how healthy it is at this moment. But I can tell you, there's been one retailer out there that I'm friends with, and he often butts heads with me on social media. If you remember Larry from Larry's Comics, we haven't seen him here on the channel for quite some time. We still keep in contact, but mostly he likes to refute me when I'm on social media and I have anything bad to say about DC Comics because he says they're healthy. Well, he sent out a tweet in response to me putting this page on social media, and he had some dire numbers to portray regarding sales and interest in DC Comics. This is what Larry from Larry's Comics said on social media. I set up a Big Apple Con last weekend in New York City with a display of the last 6 months of books. DC Comics has a legit problem. 80% Marvel sales, 50% indie sales, 5% DC sales. The line is dead to the public. Obviously, the information provided from Larry in that tweet is a small sample size. It's only one weekend at one convention from one stand. But those numbers are quite overwhelming. 80% Marvel, 15% indie comics, 5% DC. Those numbers are overwhelmingly negative, and it does portray a problem. Even if it's not quite that significant, and honestly, in the whole of the comic book fandom, I don't believe the interest is like 80, 15, 5, or the spending habits throughout everywhere. But it does tell you that DC Comics in its current state and the comics they're putting out right now are kind of dead. And this backs up completely the numbers that ICV2.com and Comicron have been putting together. And you can point to things like Sensational Wonder Woman Special Number 1, because the story does continue. And of course, the boy dressed up as Wonder Woman, tiara, skirt and all, does get beat up by a fat kid because I guess he's Batman associated. He's got to be a jerk off. And he says, Wonder Woman, seriously? You aren't even tough enough to be a girl hero. Anyway, Wonder Woman's not cool, but then neither are you. And leave me alone, Jared. Ignoramus, what'd you say? I said nice makeup. I don't know who's coming to DC Comics or going to their comic shop for stories like this. 12 people maybe across the nation, 114 across the world. There isn't a big enough audience to support these kind of stories. If these were coming once or twice a month or maybe every other month or something like that, perhaps there's some sustainability in here and it provides a little bit of diversity in the line. But this is much more emblematic of the crap that we're being served by DC Comics right now than anything else. We're getting instances like this, it's seemingly weekly right now at DC Comics. I'm trying to keep up with it, but I honestly don't even have enough time to cover all the crap that DC Comics are putting out right now. They have a legitimate problem. They're also trying to make this new Justice League that's going to be taking over in Dark Crisis. They want to get John Kent, Jace Fox, JoJo Bolin's fine ass, Yara 4, and Jackson Hyde over as the new Justice League. And they're going to be just as good, if not better, than the Justice League you and I have been reading for all these years that have all these classic tales. And I'm not completely opposed with going in a new direction and maybe finding some new heroes. I just don't like the method in which they're doing it, and it's destined to fail because we've seen it happen over and over again. But DC Comics and Marvel Comics can never actually learn from their failure or even learn from the success of other publishers or other comic book producers around the world and implement them into their line and produce a better product. They can only continuously fail doing the same thing over and over. This week we get Aquaman number 2. I have seen screenshots of it, but the resolution is not good enough for me to put up on here. It would be far too blurry and you would not like looking at it. But Jackson Hyde has that power to where he can manipulate water. He almost can use water like a Green Lantern makes constructs. So if he decides he has a water trident in his hand, he has a water trident in his hand. And it turns out there is water in all of our bodies. We've known this since we were children, that the vast majority of the human body is actually made of H2O, aqua, water, whatever you want to call it. And this week, we're going to get to see Jackson Hyde, about to be the newest member of the Justice League in Dark Crisis, right? Because they're trying to get these characters over as full-fledged heroes that are just as good, if not better, than their predecessors. So he's the new Aquaman very soon. And obviously in Aquaman The Becoming, that was the whole premise of the story. In this week's Aquaman number 2, and I made a huge mistake trusting Brandon Thomas and thinking that he was going to be a big deal at DC Comics. This guy is terrible. You're going to get to see Jackson Hyde use his water powers to start torturing people. You know those really uncomfortable moments in war movies and you're like, oh my God, they're breaking his toes and you're doing this and all that kind of stuff. He's going to do that to Orm, but he's going to use his water powers. How heroic. I know a lot of people like to make fun of Arthur Curry Aquaman because he's not edgy enough in comparison to maybe Batman, or maybe he's not as powerful as a Superman or a Wonder Woman, or maybe his power isn't as cool as a Green Lantern or a Flash type character. But Aquaman has been around for a very long time. It's an established character with established powers. and an Aquaman would never use their powers like this. This is awful. Can you imagine Arthur Curry getting his hand on Black Manta and just torturing him over hours or days at a time? Could you even root for Aquaman anymore? Yet Jackson Hyde is the character that DC Comics, under Jim Lee's leadership, believes is ready for the mantle of Aquaman. But the writer can't even show that he's worthy of it. He's completely not. He's not a hero. You just tortured somebody. That's disgusting behavior and another roadblock to getting these characters over as the new Justice League. Where does it end? When can DC Comics just find a nice soft spot for 2 months where they don't just destroy a character or do something stupid like the sensational Wonder Woman special #1, or you have boys going out in tiaras and skirts like it's normal? I get that there's an agenda going on, but DC Comics customers and really comic book customers aren't really enamored with it on whole. Are there pieces of the audience or portions of the demographics that buy comic books that think this is great stuff? Yes, but it's so insignificant. It's so small. It's so minute that placating this audience so much, the supply versus demand dynamics with what stories Marvel and DC specifically right now are putting out, that it doesn't even make sense. There's this huge imbalance, and that's why people are choosing to walk away, and that's why DC Comics finds itself in the dire straits that it's in. They could become irrelevant to modern comics, to the current comic book industry within the next 18 to 24 months if they can't do anything to change their fortunes with their customers. Marvel Comics certainly make their own mistakes in their publishing line, but they haven't done near the damage in the last 18, 24 months to their brands and their properties that DC Comics have. And DC Comics don't have the MCU to back them up, and they were already a smaller fan base to begin with. Quite frankly, DC Comics don't have the cushion to make mistakes that Marvel Comics have. They certainly have more than other publishers, but it feels like they've worn out any type of goodwill their audience actually has for them, and people are just walking away, and they may never come back. This is a real problem, and Jim Lee better get his head out of his ass, or his legacy in comic books won't be X-Men #1 and the biggest selling comic book in the history of the world. It's going to be the guy that destroyed DC Comics, the man that was in charge when DC Comics essentially died and became irrelevant. Is that what Jim Lee wants his legacy to be? I don't think so, but that's kind of where he's heading towards if something doesn't change soon. I've actually been talking about this very problem at DC Comics for several years on the channel. I want to point you toward a video from September of 2020 where I talk about how DC Comics had really embraced agendas and going woke, and they were going to continue it in the years ahead. And it turns out I was giving fans a spoiler of what was to come for DC Comics in 2021 and 2022.